Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to introduce David Schiff from Iron Mountain Home Inspections. Dave was kind enough to join Green Team Realty to talk about the selling points of older homes. Something I don't know about you guys, but I certainly am always debating. I grew up in an older home, actually an 1865 home, and I always swore when I got out of there that I would never do it again because I felt like it was constant maintenance. And now I live in a home that was built in the late 80s, early 90s, and that too is a lot of maintenance. So I guess we can maybe try to solve that debate here in this training session, and perhaps any other subsequent ones that we come up with. So welcome, Dave. Just want to introduce you.
Hello, how are you? Um, Before I get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Pip Klein, because this webinar was really her idea. She and I were chatting about how we both really enjoy old homes, and then we got around to talking about how the considerations in buying an old house can be a lot different than considerations for buying a newer home. And Pip said, well, why don't you do a webinar? And I ran it by Jeff, and Jeff liked the idea, so here we are. You know, the one thing I wanted to mention is that, as you guys I'm sure really know, is that buying a house, any house, but particularly an old home, it can be a real anxiety-producing time for clients. And of course, the antidote to anxiety is knowledge, and that includes the knowledge that you impart as realtors as you lead your clients through the process of buying a home. And it includes the knowledge that I, as a home inspector, impart as I inform my clients about the structure and the systems they're buying. So feel free to jump in at any time. I'd love this to be very collaborative. And I want to start out with just a very quick overview of what we're going to cover today, or hopefully get through. Are we able to? There we go. Okay. First of all, we're going to dispel a couple of myths. And one myth is that old houses are drafty energy hogs. I'll talk about how, in some ways, old houses can be more energy efficient than newer homes. And the other myth is that replacing windows will save you a bundle in energy costs. Regardless of what the advertising from window companies may tell you, there are good reasons to perhaps to replace windows, but it definitely they won't save you money over the long run in energy costs. They won't pay for themselves. From there, I'd like to talk a bit about water, and I'll tell you about why older homes are actually much less susceptible to rot than newer homes are. And then we'll talk about water in the basement, which we've all been kind of conditioned to think is a terrible thing. But when it comes to old houses, sometimes it's just par for the course. It's not that big a deal. And from there, assuming we have time, we'll get into some of the fun stuff. Some of the appealing things about old houses that you might want to point out to your clients when you encounter them. Old house lovers are drawn to the beauty of wide plank pumpkin pine floors, chestnut moldings, and other signature old house features. And we'll talk about why you almost never find them in new homes. So let's get started here.
So Dave, you're not screen sharing right now. I don't know if you intended to do that.
Yes, we did. We're not screen sharing, you said.
You were up until this very moment.
Okay.
Now it's Dave.
Now you're seeing me?
Yep. So just hit your share button again on Zoom.
Okay.
The green share button.
Oh, we did want to see me at this point. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay. As the cost of fossil fuels keeps going up, both in dollars and in damage to the planet, energy efficiency has become a top priority for home buyers. Today's homes meet this demand in two ways. One way is efficient heating and cooling systems, and the other is we make houses as tight as we can, that is, well insulated. So in other words, we heat or cool air as cheaply as possible. Then we insulate the house to keep warm air in during the winter and keep it out in the summer. Now, this creates some potential problems because trapping air means trapping moisture. And I'll be touching on that a little later. But the thing is that early houses didn't have central heat, of course, and they didn't have air conditioning. So builders looked for passive ways to make homes more comfortable. It was one standard practice for builders to give, really careful thought to how a house would be oriented in relation to the sun's path. And this was not only in the orientation of the roof, as this diagram shows, but also in the layout of the rooms. You got to keep in mind that cooking on a wood or coal stove kicked off a lot more heat than a modern kitchen does. So the kitchen usually was on the cooler north side of the house, but the parlor, on the other hand, would be on the south side to enjoy the warmth of the sun. And in fact, that's exactly the configuration in my late 19th century home over here on Ryerson Road. To this day, builders of custom homes still do consider the sun's path, but developers who are working with standardized house plans often don't. Typically, they'll just plop the house on the lot with the front door and the big windows facing the street. Older homes in cold climates, on the other hand, often have the most windows facing south. Landscaping was used to advantage too, and sometimes still is. I mean, deciduous trees would be strategically positioned for shade in summer, and they'd lose their leaves to let the winter sunlight through. And builders also used evergreens as windbreaks. Now, in this diagram, you can see that the sun's path is high in summer and low in winter. And
hey, Dave, before you go away from that slide there, I want to point something out that it almost seems that now it should be counterintuitive to that, because we want the solar panels on the back side of the house, right? So perhaps we should face the back of the house to the south, because southern exposure is the highest.
It depends on how important those solar panels are in relation to solar gain that you're going to get through the windows. So, I mean, if you're willing to live with the panels on the front, basically you want to put the panels facing the sun, however the house is oriented. Well, the reason this is important, like the fact that the winter sun is lower, this is one main reason, there are others, but and higher in summer, is because many houses have wonderful, deep porches. It's a great place to sit in a rocker and enjoy the shade and chat with passing neighbors. But a well-designed porch does more than that. Smart builders plan the depth and the height of the porch to admit low winter sunlight and shield out high summer rays. So that's a big part of porch design. Now you'll be looking at me again. So I want to talk now a little bit about thermal. Are there any questions, by the way, about siting of houses? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about thermal mass. You've probably all walked into an unair-conditioned old house in the summertime, and you've noticed that it's comfortably cooler than the outdoors. That's thermal mass at work. While thermal mass and modern insulation both help keep houses warm in winter and cool in summer, they work in very different ways. Essentially, insulation works like a thermos. It blocks heat from flowing in or out. But thermal mass, on the other hand, it acts more like a battery. It stores heat. Then once it's saturated with heat, or the ambient outdoor temperature drops, it begins releasing that warmth as quickly as it absorbs it. Now, before insulation came on the scene, builders relied on thermal mass to help keep homes at a comfortable temperature. They did this by building with solid stone or brick. In the case of timber frames, they often filled the walls with rubble stone. The rubbles didn't have a structural purpose. They didn't help hold the house up or anything. It just added thermal mass. In addition, old-timey plaster also has more thermal mass than modern drywall does. So dense materials like masonry slowly absorb lots of the sun's warmth during the day and release it during the night. This mediates the temperature in the house. It's cooler on summer days and it's warmer on winter nights. Now, in our climate, thermal mass alone usually isn't enough to keep a home at the nice, steady temperature that modern folks have come to expect. But it will still reduce reliance on mechanically heated or cooled air, especially if the house has been retrofitted with insulation. In my old house, again, for example, it's on a shady lot. So that combined with the thermal mass, we often don't use our window air conditioners until August. So any questions about thermal mass and how it works? Okay.
Dave, are you going to touch on geothermal systems by chance?
I'm not today, no. Because I don't know that that's really an old house issue. Pretty much the same for an old house or a new house, I would think. Now, but I do want to touch on radiators. You know, speaking of mechanical heating, hot water radiators are the most common central heating system in old houses. You'll also occasionally find steam radiators. And while radiators have been in common use since the late 1800s, they're still the best way to distribute warmth throughout a house. Radiators use less energy than forced hot air systems. They provide a more consistent temperature, and they're quieter than forced hot air systems. And they don't blow dust and allergens around the house. So you might ask, why is forced hot air so common in new construction? Well, the answer to that is simple. While walls are open during construction, ductwork is cheaper to install than water pipes. And that same ductwork can also serve the air conditioning system. So it's a lot cheaper for builders to install forced hot air systems. But it's almost always impractical to try to retrofit ducts into an existing house. That's why most older homes that were built before central heating and were retrofitted have radiators. Now, when hot water systems are installed in new homes, they almost always have those long baseboard radiators instead of old-fashioned cast iron units. And it's true that baseboards take up less space, and they do distribute the heat a little more evenly around the room. But for my money, I'll take the old cast iron radiators over baseboards any day. Cast iron radiators take advantage of our old friend thermal mass. When the system turns off, radiators continue to release heat for a lot longer than baseboards do. This makes radiators more efficient, and it prolongs the life of your boiler because it will cycle less often. Plus, those ornate old radiators are just part of the charm of an old house. Now, in this slide is a simplified illustration of how hot water radiator systems work. Of course, a house will have many radiators rather than the one that's shown here, but it will be a loop just like you see here. Water flows from the boiler into a radiator, through that radiator to the next, and so on. After the last radiator, the water flows back to the boiler to get heated again. Now, this system works okay, but because water cools as it moves from one radiator to the next, rooms at the far end of the loop can be chilly. So the good news is that old-timey radiators, big old cast iron radiators, can be coupled with a new super efficient boiler. And I'm lucky enough to have a system like that in my old house. And in my house, you can tell from the chimneys that the house originally had stoves. At some point, radiators replaced the stoves. And then maybe, I don't know, 30 years or so ago, new pipes were configured into 6 loops, creating 6 zones with 6 separate thermostats, about 1 zone for every room. This is much more efficient than the old single loop system because there's a direct line to every 2 radiators. This means the water doesn't get cool as it does at the end of a single loop. It also means we're running around the house adjusting radiators. But the upside of that is it lets us heat just the rooms that we're using. So if you go down in the basement and you see something like what's shown here, you're in luck. This photo shows 6 zones. Each zone has a red manual turn-off valve, and the metal boxes with the white labels are valves controlled by the thermostats. The next thing you want to do is look around for a water heater. If you don't see one, that means that one of these zones is being used for domestic hot water. And that could be a really good system because it gives you, without having a water storage system, it gives you hot water on demand. Any questions at all about?
Dave, it's funny that you talk about the indirect, hot water as opposed to a standalone hot water tank. And I've, always asked the opinion of a lot of home inspectors that I go through, like, what's better? And, it seems like the answer is a little bit of a mixed bag because, you're firing your boiler throughout the warm months when you
That's
have
true.
an indirect system versus a standalone hot water heater. But I guess it does seem to be a little bit more efficient. But then again, your boiler's working a lot more, and it's a much more expensive unit than just a standalone hot water heater.
That is true. Keep in mind, though, that you are using one zone. So if it's set up that way, all the burners on the boiler aren't coming on. Probably just the one for that one zone. And particularly, I had a system like that in an old house I lived in Frenchtown, New Jersey, and it was an older boiler, and it was a oil boiler. And we actually found that the fact that it was coming on during the summertime was keeping it from getting like kind of clogged up. And the technician said it was actually good for the boiler.
Okay.
So there is a toss up. It probably does cost you more to heat the water in the warm weather.
Right.
Could I interject as well?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Dave. It's Rebecca Hundley. We've met
Oh, hi,
before.
Rebecca.
You did a home inspection for me.
Yes.
I also have a boiler that was also heating the water in my home, and it was a newer boiler. But at some point, the function that heats the water in the boiler broke, and it wasn't heating our household water anymore.
Okay.
And it ended up being a more efficient solution to install an instant on-demand propane hot water heater than to replace the boiler. There was no way to fix it. Like, they couldn't fix the boiler. So it really, in the end, it ended up being an advantage for me because now my propane system works great and it's on demand, which is a fair point. But it makes me actually leery of the systems where the boiler's heating the water for the whole house, because a boiler is a very expensive investment. And to have, it's like getting one of those TVs with the CD player, with the DVD player in it. When the DVD player works, you're still stuck with a TV with a DVD player. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, that's a fair point. Yeah, it's true. There are obviously trade-offs. But I mean, I would say if you saw a system like that when you're selling a house, I don't know that I would, put it down as a negative. It's just it's another way of doing it. Anything else on that?
Yeah, I think just to hammer it home for somebody who may be a new licensee and, is going to start showing homes to people and go on home inspections. I think it's a mixed bag, this issue of the indirect hot water heating system versus a standalone. I think that people can make arguments for it and against it. And I think Rebecca's experience, although it is a very real one, I don't necessarily know that outcome is common in all situations. I think she just got a bad situation that happened to her, because I've sold a lot of homes where the hot water heater is tied into the boiler and it was fine, and I've never heard a complaint from the clients, and it seemed to work okay for many, many years. So, but it's good to talk with people about the pros and the cons, right? It makes
Absolutely.
you more valuable in their eyes because you have knowledge.
Exactly. And that's what they're
There's
looking
one thing.
for. Okay.
I'm sorry, Dave. This is Steve
yes.
K. Yeah, this is Steve K. One last thing is you've got a temperature lift. Recirculating heater will only have to lift the water 20 degrees versus 65 degrees coming from the street. And there's a big savings there.
Yep, that's a good point. Absolutely. All right. All right, if there's nothing else, we'll move on to talk about windows a little bit. Now, as I mentioned before, there are some good reasons to replace windows in an old house. Of course, they're double pane typically, so you don't have to hassle with storm windows. And They operate very easily, and some actually tilt out for cleaning, which is very nice and convenient. Many of them don't require painting. I mean, most common replacement windows are vinyl, which of course you don't paint at all. And then you'll have vinyl clad with wood, which often has wood like exposed on the inside, but clad with vinyl on the outside. So you could paint the inside, but not the outside. Then there's aluminum, which you never paint. And some windows now are made out of fiberglass, which you can paint, but you don't have to. However, replacement, as I mentioned, replacement windows won't pay for themselves in energy savings. And here's the reason why. New windows are indeed twice as efficient as a single pane, but they're only 15% more efficient than a single pane with a storm. Since windows cover only a small part of the house, total house envelope, new windows typically only save about 5 to 10% in energy costs. And when you look at the cost of replacing a house full of windows, and the fact that many replacement windows only last a few decades, typically they won't pay for themselves. Any thoughts on that? I know can be a little controversial, but there is data that supports that. Okay.
Before you move on, I have a question.
Okay.
So in my house, we have these blinds that are, I forget what they call, but they're like, they're like cloth, and they have like tubes going up and down, and you can lift them up and lift them down.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they help with drafts. Is that just my mind, or is that real?
No, that's real. Good, well-fitting blinds, particularly, you're talking about like they're like pleated, right? So they have like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So they're creating another air pocket,
Mm-hmm.
and they can definitely block drafts and add some insulation. Absolutely. I wanted to mention some. There's some other considerations here when it comes to replacing windows. Now, as I mentioned, new wood windows typically are clad with vinyl on the outside. At least. Rarely do you see totally wood new windows. And the reason for that, I believe, is because new wood really doesn't stand up well to moisture, even when it's painted. Windows built before 1930, on the other hand, are probably made out of old growth longleaf pine. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but old growth wood, particularly old growth longleaf pine, is a lot more rot resistant than contemporary woods. The other thing is that old windows, oops, had a little technical problem here. Oh, okay, so unless they're in really bad shape, old windows take more elbow grease and skill to repair. Scraping out and replacing putty is the most common repair, and something just about anybody can learn to do. So if you have some, young, energetic clients who are looking to get some sweat equity out of an old house, this is one really good way that they can do it, and really start getting some experience in fixing up a house, because it's pretty straightforward. And another thing is that, when the proverbial baseball goes through the window, with old windows, broken pane just means a trip to Wadeson's or some other hardware store for where they'll cut you some replacement glass that you can put in. Whereas with new windows, you're breaking that, factory sealed double pane with an argon gas perhaps inside. And a lot of times that means you need a new window. Now, if old windows don't work, very often it's broken sash cords. And you can see that the sash weights that you probably know are counterweights that make the window go up. If these are broken, they're pretty easy to to reattach and get the window working again. Unfortunately, many were deliberately cut by misguided renovators who thought that they would be, by stuffing the pockets with insulation, they would be saving on energy. But really, it's not worth destroying the usefulness of the window by doing that. So anyway, are there any other questions?
Yeah, before you move off that slide, I wanted to point something out to people. Again, new licensees, people who are trying to add value to clients' knowledge of their home that they're about to buy. So the home that I live in, like I said, it was built in the late 80s. And when they built them, they actually put Marvin windows in, just like what you're talking about, Dave. They're wood on the inside and vinyl clad on the outside.
Yep.
And they're actually really good windows. I mean, Dave, you know, Marvin is a great brand, better than Anderson, and from what I hear. And a lot of houses in my neighborhood, I've noticed they've ripped them out and put in vinyl windows.
Really?
And yeah, and like it's like common, people are like replacing these windows, and I'm like, what are you doing? So, some of mine were not working, and they were pretty banged up, but I'm like, and my wife was really like pushing to replace them, and I'm like, wait a second, there's got to be a better way. So I just went down to Kukin, or you could go to your local building supplier, and I ended up finding a company that actually repairs Marvin windows. They were not thrilled to come all the way up here to Warwick, New York to do it, but I was persistent and I stayed on them, and they did it, and they basically fixed them all so they're functioning perfectly now. And I had a good local handyman take the time to scrape them and paint them, and they look beautiful. They're like new.
Yeah, they're great. I have Marvin's too. That's good to know in case I have any problems.
Yeah, it was funny that the repair guy told me, he's like, do not pass my name out. They
He doesn't want to come to Warwick.
No, he didn't. But maybe there's a business opportunity for, somebody in your realm to become a Marvin repair person, because they basically sent up one of their handymen from their company, and he knocked it out in a few hours, and I paid him quite a bit of money. So
right.
I have to,
I don't know if you have this type, but Marvin has these replacement kits where you don't have to disturb the moldings, or they're actually like spring-loaded
yes,
things that go in the sides.
Yeah,
and
that's what
those are actually very good for old houses because they look good, and you don't have to disturb the moldings to install.
Yeah, I didn't have to take any of the moldings off. They were able to work within the confines of the window space. So,
and they do that without actually reducing the profile of the window. Well, that's one of the problems with a lot of replacement windows is particularly vinyl, because vinyl needs to be wider to have the structure it needs. Often the area of the window is reduced, and they can look really bad in old houses.
Yeah, they do.
Okay, anything else? Anybody? Okay. And now speaking a little bit about storm windows. Now aluminum, when we think about storm windows, typically we'll think about those knuckle busting aluminum ones that, they're never easy to get up and down, and they look kind of bad, particularly on an old house on the outside. And then there's the even older
1865 farmhouse.
Yes, exactly. And then there's the older storm windows that you'll see where you got to get up on a ladder and put them up and down. Actually, I had those in a house that I lived in Frenchtown, New Jersey, and they were all nicely stored in the garage, and they were all labeled. That was very considerate, except they were labeled Jill's left window and Bob's right window. So I never could figure out which one went where. But nowadays you can get new interior storm windows that can be made. They're made of glass, or as you see in this image here, flexible polymer. And they're very lightweight. They're unobtrusive, and they won't disturb the historic facade. So that's something to consider.
Where do you get those, Dave? I've never seen that before.
That's a good question. I'll find out and drop you an email.
That'd be great.
Sure. Let me make a note. Okay. All right. Now let's talk a bit about water. You know, as I mentioned, water is the #1 enemy of any house. Now, any house, as long as it's in good repair, does a good job of repelling rain and snow, as long as your roof is in good shape and you have gutters that are working properly. And that's the case whether the house is new or it's 100 years old. But once you heat or cool a house and then make it anything that starts to approach airtight, you create a more insidious, usually hidden problem. It all starts with a dew point. That's when water vapor in the air hits a surface and cools enough to become liquid water. You've probably seen that on a humid day, you know, on a toilet tank. When the moisture in the air hits that cool toilet tank, it turns the water and it can actually start to drip. Well, that can happen inside walls. And if enough of that water becomes trapped for long enough, say between the insulation and the wall or in a bathroom linen closet, the result can be mold and or rot. Now, before houses were tightened up with insulation, weather stripping, and storm windows, water vapor rarely got trapped and the dew point wasn't a problem. Plus, old plaster walls allow vapor to escape more easily than modern drywall. Well-designed modern houses provide escape routes for air to prevent more moisture problems. For example, as you probably know, if you see insulated attic rafters, you also want to see ridge and soffit vents. Now, most older homes have also been tightened up over the years, and so trapped vapor is a possibility for them too. Hopefully, if insulation has been added, the dew point was considered before it was installed or when it was installed. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that now, but a competent home inspector like me knows how to detect potential as well as active moisture problems in a house of any age. But my main point is that, good ventilation aside, the main reason older homes are more rot resistant than new homes is that old houses were built with old growth lumber. Old growth timber grew in forests where trees competed with each other for sunlight. New lumber is planted in neat rows and gets plenty of sunlight because the lumber industry, for obvious reasons, wants it to grow fast. And as a result, old growth wood is denser and more resinous. It has more resin than modern lumber. And so it's a lot more rot resistant. Any questions about that? Okay. The other water related topic I wanted to touch on is basements. When it comes to modern houses, we think of basements as potential living space. We want to be able to add drywall, ceiling, and a finished floor, and that means we want the basement to be dry. And thanks to modern foundation drains and waterproofing methods, most basements are dry. Of course, if the water table is high and the water really wants to find its way in, it can be tough to stop it. And that's why some houses do have problems with water. Now, once upon a time, folks didn't care much if water found its way into the basement, or the cellar as they more typically called it. They weren't planning a rec room down there, and there wasn't even a furnace or a water heater to worry about getting wet. The foundation was made of stone, which was porous, with spaces between, and there were no drains. The floor was dirt, and the purpose of the foundation and the cellar was simply to raise the house out of the dirt so the floor framing would stay dry and not rot. So if water occasionally found its way down there, what was the harm? As long as it didn't soak the wood framing and it could find its way out. Again, my old house is a perfect example of this. First time I went down in the cellar 25 years ago when I was buying the house, I knew right away that water got in there. The first clue was that the furnace and the water heater are raised about 8 inches off the floor. And the second clue was that the original dirt floor was paved with concrete, and there's a trough running down the middle and around the perimeter that drains everything to the downhill wall where there's a drain to daylight. And sure enough, once or 3 times a decade, water comes through the bottom of the uphill stone foundation wall, and it perks right up through the concrete, and then it drains out. I knew this when I bought the house, and when I sell it, I'll make sure the buyer knows it too. The point is, it's really just not a big deal, and it's just a fact of life of my house. Any thoughts on that or questions?
Yeah, again, from the perspective of a realtor, I think what Dave just said is really important. In fact, I had a friend who recently purchased a home, and this home had water in the basement continually, and it was like a big deal, and it was a reason why many people didn't buy it. But my friend went for it, and he was set to try to get a B dry system in there and never have water come through the basement again. And I told him, I said, listen, you're never going to solve the water problem in this basement, and it's not a big deal that there's water running through it. And this basement would have water running through it monthly, not 3 times a decade. But like I told him, keep a dehumidifier down there. Let the water run through. I did not make the sale, so I'm not, on the hook for giving construction advice. It was just one friend to another. And finally, he came around and didn't spend the $15,000, to do it. And I told him, I said, look, it's never going to be a finishable space. Get away from the idea that you're going to be able to put a playroom down there. Forget it. Your washer and your dryer are down there. It's fine. You have a dehumidifier running. The previous owners created some channels for it to escape, and you got a sump basin down there. It's fine. Just leave it. And they've been there successfully,
Yeah, and that's what I found too. So we're about 40 minutes in now, and I've got probably another half an hour or so of material. I was going to talk about irreplaceable old house features and just point out a few of those and talk a little bit about how to date an old house. I'll leave that up to you, Jeff. We can continue on, or we can leave that for another time.
Well, I don't want to go over an hour, and I don't want to cut it short because those are some good topics. So perhaps we kick it to another session that we'll do. Now, it's going to be a little bit of a time gap here because we're about to start our 2020 launch program, and we're going to have 8 training sessions in a row over the course of 2 months, once a week. So with that said, we'll just have to pick up, in another couple months, but it'll be another good, compelling topic, I think,
Okay. All right. That makes sense to me. We can pick it up. We'll set a date and pick it up there. I think those two topics go well together. It's a good logical breaking point. So does anybody else have any questions or comments about what we've covered so far? I'd love to hear from you. And if you think of anything like after the fact, feel free to give me a call. My cell phone number is 987-6644, or you can drop me an email at david@ironmountainhomeinspections.com.
And Dave, what markets do you service as far as home inspections go?
New York, any place within about 50 miles of Warwick that's in New York State.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so nobody has any questions, comments, or concerns? Going once.
Okay.
Lucy, when I see you trying, you have to unmute yourself, Lou.
I see Pip there.
I just want to tell you that it was great. I learned so much, and I'm so much more comfortable after this showing an older home.
Oh, that's great to know.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
I want to say, I love your antidote. Anxiety is knowledge. And that's so cool. If you know about something, then you can do something about it or walk away.
Exactly.
It's too much for you.
It looks like Pip also has her mic open. Go ahead, Pip.
So this is like a different topic. It's only because I have sold several houses or worked with houses from the 1700s, and it's not exactly this topic. It's the appraisal. I had 1775 carved in the stone in the fireplace. People were willing to pay an extra $50,000, but the bank said no, they didn't see it. So I like the old houses and the uniqueness of them. In fact, I've been working on a blog, What Price History, but that's been an issue that I've faced over the last few years, that the appraisal, people are willing to pay it for those unique features, And the banks don't always get it because the comps, like this one house, they're comparing Washingtonville School District, 4 bedrooms, 2 acres, built in 1990 as opposed to 1775. So right there, it's a difference. So that's just one. I personally like the old houses and what they offer to people. And there is a particular buyer for them. But the appraisal can be a problem, just FYI to those.
Yeah, I think, to the point, it's almost like the whole reason why we're doing this training session is because old homes kind of get a bad rap, right?
Exactly.
And that's Dave is here to, dispel many rumors about it and present the facts about it. But the reality is they are frowned upon just in general. Like what Pip is saying here is the banks, the banks don't really treat the old beautiful homes fairly and take into account the wide plank floors and the chestnut molding, like Dave was saying, and the plaster walls versus sheetrock and all these things that in today's day and age, if you built it that way, it would cost 5 times what it would to build the way they do now.
If you could even get the materials.
Right, exactly. So, yeah,
And
so
particular kind of buyer who wants that, and that's there are people who are seeking older homes.
And just one other point that I want to make is, if you're an agent and you kind of have an affinity for older homes, it's really important to be knowledgeable about all this stuff, and also to be knowledgeable about which home inspectors to bring in at the right time, because not every home inspector has an affinity for older homes. I mean, a lot of them tend to really enjoy the older homes, and a lot of inspections that I've been on, no matter who it's been with, if it's an older home, they kind of enjoy it because they love to see the old stuff. And I think a lot of home inspectors are in the business because they're curious by nature. But having a guy like Dave on your side is key because he can explain a lot of myths, and dispel a lot of myths to your clients.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah.
When it comes to appraisal, there's another thing, and you may know more about this, and maybe I'm wrong, but it just occurs to me. But I believe that because of reassessments, tax reassessments, my tax bill for a house that's the same size as the new house across the street is considerably lower.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
That's something you might.
That is common. That is very common. Older homes are taxed at a lower rate. So perhaps maybe when you don't get in the appraisal, you make up for it on the tax side.
Right. That may not be the case in New Jersey, because I used to be a newspaper reporter and cover municipal stuff, and in New Jersey, and there they reappraise every 10 years or so, I think. Whereas I don't think they do that in New York. So they try to even it out more in New Jersey than they do in New York. I don't know if any of your New Jersey.
Yeah, I don't know. Kathy, Kim, any of you that are down in Jersey, do you have any comments on that? That's interesting. I don't know enough about the tax levies to really comment intelligently on that.
Okay.
You probably do, Dave. You're a reporter. You're a municipal reporter. How many people can say they had that in their background?
Yeah, you'd be surprised what's in my background. All right. Well, I really enjoyed this. Thanks, guys, and thanks to everybody who came. And again, next time we will talk about some really interesting interior features that you can point out, like the chestnut moldings and why the floors are irreplaceable and things like that. And we'll talk a bit about, how to look at the timbers in the basement and the nails and things like that to help date an old house.
All right, cool. Dave, one last thing before we go.
Okay.
What is your cell phone number and your email address if somebody wants to get a hold of you to do a home inspection?
Okay, my cell phone number is 845, of course, 987-6644. And my email address is david@ironmountainhomeinspections, quite long, .com.
Long but memorable.
Right.
All right,
I realized that when I signed up for it, so, oh, this is long, but.
No, it's okay. I don't think people mind typing as long as they can remember.
No, and you only have to type it in once.
Yeah, there you go. Google does the rest after that, right?
Yep.
All right, Dave, thanks a million. This is great. We'll catch up with you in another couple of months and we'll finish off part 2, and we'll look forward to it, okay?
Sounds great. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day. Bye.